Well, hello there and welcome back. It's been a while, but we are back. This is Three Guys and the Word. My name is Andrew Ulmer, and it's good to be with fellow brothers in Christ from the Tazewell Road Church of Christ, Chris Miller and Eric Parker, who join me each time we do these videos. And it's been a little bit of a hiatus for us, but sometimes uh, life, for good reasons, uh, keeps us away, but we certainly don't want to not have these opportunities to get together and talk about whether it be Esther or, Lord willing, maybe some other books. But we've had a lot going on, and that just sometimes happens where things pop up. But it's good to be together once again. It's good to be able to uh, do these videos once more. And we hope that you yourselves, wherever you may be, are doing well. We know that there's lots going on in everyone's lives, so we don't discount that. Just life sometimes happens, but we have a great God, an all-powerful God that we should be thankful that He can help us and wants to guide us through whatever may be going on in our lives. But just to kind of see how everybody's doing, because we haven't seen one another in this type of mode in a number of weeks. So just Chris, how are things going with you? Anything new?
There's a lot new, but that's what you had asked me. Is there anything new going on when I first got on? And I'm like, well, not really, because now I get to see you guys every week, multiple times a week, which is nice. So it's not like we lose contact with each other like it used to be when we wouldn't get together to do it. So, but I feel like it's my fault somewhat that we haven't been able to get together. I know you guys have had things too, but it's like every week it seems like something's going on. And I appreciate you guys making time to do this with my schedule change, that we still can do this. It still gives me like a little bit of taste of preaching in a sense. So thanks for letting me continue to play in the sandbox, so to speak. But everybody pretty much knows we're having a baby, so that's the biggest thing that's been going on. And it's I know Eric can attest to this. It's pretty consuming of your life. Now you're thinking well, I was already thinking about Kate with everything. Now I'm thinking about another person too. So um, that's pretty crazy to think about that that's where we are right now. So like Eric said, all these things, as Kate calls my junk, will probably be coming down soon, and this is going to entirely change around me. But it's a good type of change. But I kind of been wondering what had happened to Esther, so I'm glad we're going to be able to finally sit down and talk about it uh, together today. But looking forward to, as always, to talk with you guys and to hear your perspective on the text. How's it going, Eric?
That's good. Yeah, it's been hard to get us all three kind of together for the video. It just seems like so much has been going on. But obviously very excited about Chris and Kate and expecting a baby. And as soon as he told me, I was like, I lit up like Christmas tree. I was rolling. Um, so yeah, fatherhood, that's it's a challenge, and it's a blessing for sure. I shared with the guys before we got on. I had a really interesting experience this past week. We were at the pumpkin patch with our family, and we were doing the corn maze at the end, and we stirred up a yellow jacket nest. I mean, hundreds of yellow jackets or multiple nests. I don't know. It was overwhelming. Um, and one of our kids kind of got trapped. Like me and the youngest were on one side, and Olivia and our oldest was on one side, and our son, middle child, of course, middle child syndrome. I know all about that, but he was like right there and just frozen in panic, with all the yellow jackets flying around him. But thankfully, we're all able to get out. Um, and he only got stung one time. And there definitely is a lesson in that. Life could be a lot more painful because of uh, the corruption of the world and the challenges that were introduced because of sin. But God shields us from a lot of that. That's not to say that people don't go through hard things and people die every day with difficult things. But there's a lot of shielding that takes place too, and that's something to be grateful for. So, as a parent, I'm very thankful for that. But that was hard. It's hard to even like think about it, like because I just see Adam with like all the yellow jackets flying around him. That was a scary moment as a parent. So. Um, yeah, so I'm very thankful for God's protection, and very thankful, of course, for Chris and Kate expecting. Very thankful that we can get together on the video and keep going through Esther. Andrew, how you doing, man?
Well, it's just like everybody, I don't know if it's changing the season and sometimes I don't know if seasonal affective disorder or whatever, but just people go through ups and downs in life, and that can have a wave of emotions on people. But I'm grateful that there's some good news that we can share and praise God for new life and God's providence and protection, which fits well with what we're talking about, and um, we can hopefully stir one another up and encourage one another and talk to one another and just even in this way that we're meeting one another. We've had a lot of opportunities to be out and try to reach people in the community since last time we were together. So thankful that God opened doors and that regard, just to give us opportunity to do things that we wouldn't uh, normally do. And um, but just grateful for this time together because it's so easy to get into that mode of, well, I now have an extra couple hours that where we would spend together in this way in a given week, and when things would come up, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, are we going to get back together? And I'm glad that we're able to do this because hopefully, if you've been watching our videos, you've missed them and are encouraged that we're getting back to them. And so just grateful for that and appreciate the good news that was shared. And let's tackle into part of a section of the good news of God's word. And as a reminder, we're reading from the Book of Esther, and our principal verses come from Esther 4 and verses 13 and 14, which reads, Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's household will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And so, really taking up from what we talked about last time, which has been a little bit, we went through really all of chapter 8, and that finally saw some things getting made right. Um, Mordecai got acknowledged and put in the place of the person who wanted him dead, Haman. And Haman had been uh, done away with in the previous uh, chapter. And so now um, Mordecai is really put in the position of like number two. And so now he has the influence. Um, but there still leaves this uncertainty of a decree that was made through the subversiveness of and the guile of Haman to have all the Jews eradicated. And was this looming year-long wait of anticipation of there's going to be this day throughout all the empire where the Jews could expect their extermination. Now, Esther continued to humble herself and beseech the king, and has him give a decree that the Jews can defend themselves. And it wasn't as if, okay, they could go about willy-nilly in any given time. They were going to be told, well, on that day that you were going to be exterminated, feel free to defend yourself. And even if it meant taking the lives of those who would be seeking your harm. So, King's doing what he can since he can't undo the previous command. He's making a way, at least for the Jews, to defend themselves. But Chris, from last time, just anything that really caught your eye?
What's interesting, we've gone through and looked at this book, and you kind of talked about this a little bit, and I know Eric's brought it up too. The irony of Haman wanting so much for his life, uh, and the hatred in his heart really dictating all of his decision making, that he ultimately misses everything that he wanted in life, and it's given to the person that he hates so passionately. Um, Haman's always kind of in Ahasuerus' ear. He's trying to, get as close to him as he can. He's trying to make him like him. You can almost see throughout this, give me the positions of power and authority. The first decree, I mean, he even was able to manipulate him to get his signet ring for the decree. So you have all this going on, and then Mordecai's just kind of this lowly guy in the background. What we know is that he raises Esther. He loves Esther. He cares about her. But he's not inside the king's palace. He's not someone that you may look at and say, "Oh, this is an amazing person." Well, it's interesting how God providentially, which I know we talked about that before we started today with Eric's story, God providentially guides Esther and Mordecai. And I'm not trying to take away from what God did for them, but it also comes down to their free will of Mordecai allowing God to guide him and use him. His character throughout this story, he's trying to push Esther to do the right thing, like we read in our principal verse. He's trying to get Esther to stand up for what's right, to speak out on behalf of her people. Him and Haman could not be more polar opposites of each other. And kind of the most ironic thing to me is that visual that we got earlier in the text where Haman's having to basically parade Mordecai around the city. That was what Ahasuerus told him to do, and he probably hated that. And even Haman's family's like, "You're not going to prevail over Mordecai. It's not going to happen." And I know what I'd brought up with that was he wasn't fighting against Mordecai at that point. He was really trying to push against God by destroying God's people and destroying Mordecai. He wasn't going to win against God. Haman could have been in Ahasuerus' pocket. He could have had everything that he possibly wanted. You're not going to defeat God. We see that throughout the Old and New Testament. God is going to be victorious in the end. But what we had talked about in chapter 8, it's like Ahasuerus has to kind of go back and fix his mistake. It's like, oh man, I got manipulated. I shouldn't have sent this out. So now, really, even though Esther's a good influence and Mordecai's a good influence, he still gets basically manipulated again to undo what he shouldn't have done in the first place, which he ultimately sends that out. And then Mordecai ends up, kind of stepping up to the plate and being an advocate for the Jews, but also being the person that's, best positioned to do what Haman was doing anyway. which I think is interesting. And it made me think of a verse. I think it was Eric had shared this verse not too long ago in a sermon. But Jesus talking about in Luke 14, verse 11, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. When we read the story of Esther, I think I know our principal verse comes out of Esther, but throughout multiple episodes of this, I've thought of that verse from Jesus, because God exalts Esther, God exalts Mordecai, and Haman ultimately was humbled from trying to exalt himself. So, just looking at the text, seeing everything that we have seen so far, I don't know how you could read this text and say God doesn't exist, that God doesn't care, and that God doesn't love people, because God is extremely active in the story without really even having to tell the writer of the book, hey, tell him I did this. We can see that God did it, over and over again. And as Eric pointed out, God still works providentially in our lives today too, which is such a blessing. And we should feel very honored that God would care enough about us to move through our lives too. We got Eric.
I'll be brief. One thing we mentioned with the horses, in verse 14, they're sending out the decree. It mentions the horses sired by the royal stud. Persian horses are notorious in history for how fast they are, for how strong they are, for how enduring they are. So that's kind of just an interesting historical point. The second thing with Mordecai, and it's like almost over the top. He's in royal robes, blue and white, large crown of gold, garment of fine linen and purple. It's like an over the top sort of thing. That's exactly what Haman wanted, and that's exactly what Mordecai gets. Um, and obviously, this is like a preemptive sort of celebration because the day that has been a terror in the mind of the Jews for so long. There has been a decree drafted up that they could defend themselves, but we're still waiting for that huge conflict. And that's how the book ends. But really, towards the end of chapter 8, it's like everything's, happy-go-lucky and good, but you still have that sword hanging over. And it's like, what's gonna happen here? Um, you get the impression, of course, from the language that, like, of course, it says the dread of the Jews had fallen on them at the end of chapter 8. So you don't expect probably that there's going to be a whole lot of conflict, maybe. But then chapter 9 fills you in on some of that and says, actually, there was quite a bit of conflict. Again, as Andrew pointed out, it's not like open season, you can attack whoever you want to, whenever you want to. But there's going to be a day in the 12th month on the 13th day where there's going to be a lot of bloodshed. So there is this kind of thing hanging over them, over everybody, hanging over Ahasuerus, hanging over the whole kingdom. What is this day going to look like? It'll be a day that lives in infamy, for the Persians, and the Jews. And of course, they're going to have Purim, which is going to come out of this, the Feast of Purim. Um, but it's still kind of hanging over. And then one last thing, verse 16. For the Jews, there was light and gladness and joy and honor. At the beginning of the book, when you see Haman's plans against them, there was bitterness, wailing, weeping, and fasting. And that has been turned into light and gladness and joy and honor, which is a really neat turnaround.
Well, let's look into chapter 9. And Chris, if you don't mind reading the first 10 verses.
Esther chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. Now, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, and that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all the people, and all the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, I knew you were going to ask me to read this with all these names. I see Eric smiling.
I
I,
gave
I'm not.
a break and I took myself a break. I'm sorry.
I don't even know if I'm even going to try to pronounce these because I'm going to absolutely butcher them. But they are the 10 sons of Haman, and that's what matters. The son of Hammedath, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. To me, if I would have read that, it would have ruined everything I read before for me. But I know the names are important.
You gotta say it with confidence.
There's no way.
I'll read them if you really want me to. I will.
I'll let you talk about them when you go through and talk about it.
All right.
But I think it's just so interesting. It's like Eric said, something Eric said right before we read it. All that Haman wanted, the irony of Mordecai getting it, and really all that Haman wanted to happen to the Jews probably happens to the individuals who would have been with Haman trying to destroy the Jews. Um, and you think of God, God could have wrote in here that the fear of himself fell upon all the people, but it's written that the fear of Mordecai fell upon the people. Um, and you think about Mordecai, it wasn't like, oh, we're terrified of Mordecai. It's more so a respect thing. Mordecai did what he needed to do. He did what was the right thing. Obviously, he sinned at some point and fell short, just like all of us, but he was a respectable person. And for me, when you think of how Haman was, it probably wasn't very hard for him probably to top how Haman was. Now, for obviously people who hated the Jews, he probably couldn't have done anything right in order, they probably thought Haman was the greatest of all time. But it's so interesting when it says that day came that they had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred. So it's like you can imagine, like Eric had pointed out, and Andrew did too, kind of this countdown for the Jews of this day coming where they're going to be destroyed. There's another group of people in this that had the same countdown of thinking just a little bit more time till we can finally destroy the Jews, till we finally can take care of them. And you can almost imagine maybe them going around town, gathering people together. This day is drawing near. We're going to destroy the Jews. Almost kind of similar to Haman. Haman going around, getting all of his ducks in a row so he can be next to Ahasuerus. Then the opposite happens again. And you think of the Persians, it makes me think back to Exodus as well. The Persians could have stomped the Jews out. I know Eric's going through his Ezekiel class. The talking about Babylon, you're talking about all these big nations. If God really wanted to, God could have said, fine, then I'm going to use Nebuchadnezzar to completely wipe out the children of Israel. And logically speaking, when you look at these nations, a lot of times they could have, but God protects the remnant. And in this instance, they could have had Ahasuerus. You could get Alexander the Great later on. You could get all the greatest leaders in world history, and you could assemble them all on the same battlefield together. You are not going to defeat what God's will is for humanity. And that's something that I think a lot of people could learn today, too. That's one thing that's so fascinating about the Bible. We're like, oh, all these people are anti God now. People have been anti God for a long time. And the anti God people may think that they can fight everything that God stands for. You're not going to defeat God. It's not going to happen. And Haman's gone. He's already been executed. But it's interesting that we're not, God's like, oh, Haman's done in the story. No, the 10 sons of Haman that I couldn't pronounce probably a single of their name, they all get wiped out too. So once again, you could probably imagine Haman maybe the responsibility that a father has to their children Haman may have been, filling their minds with all sorts of hateful things about the Jews and Mordecai, and they're getting ready, and then their dad's, you know, murdered. He dies. So that we're going to get back at Mordecai. We're going to get back at the Jews. Nope. Everything turns on its head. They're the ones who end up getting executed. And, you think about, I just keep coming back to the same thing with this story. It says the Jews defeated all their enemies and did what they pleased to those who hated them. There's one explanation behind that. God. How do they survive Egypt? God. How does God take Abraham and build this nation from him? Only he could do that. That's what's so impressive about this story and so many other ones that we read of in the scriptures. You look at this and you're like, there's no way this could take this turn and this could happen. Only God could do it. And that's what I find so amazing is, the Jews at certain points probably feel just so powerless. And it's because they forgot who was fighting for them. And I think that's a really good lesson for us too. Things may not look always the brightest and the best, but we do have to understand that God is in control and God is going to work things out according to his perfect will that sometimes may be hard for us to understand, but at the end of the day, his will is going to be accomplished. And I can't even imagine, before I give it to you, Eric, the roller coaster. We read it like in real time, like we're sitting here reading it. We may get done with the section in about 10 minutes. But the years, the months of like this roller coaster of emotions and things happening and changing, the Jews probably that day were probably like, this played out way differently than we originally thought. Um, and that goes back to God again, for me. What you got, Eric?
Yeah, it's been a year in the making. I mean, as far as this goes, the original decree was like a year prior to this, so there was dread for a whole long time on the part of the Jews. But then that dread that the Jews experience is like transferred over to their enemies, which again, I like the connections to the Exodus. That's very similar to what happens during the invasion and conquest of the land too. That's what happened at Jericho is the dread of the Jews and the God of the Jews fell upon the people. So Rahab said. So definitely a lot of connections here. Um, it's you would think that with everything that had turned against the people that they would just say, you know what? We're not going to attack the Jews because um, doesn't seem like things are working out too good. So we're going to bail on that. But unfortunately, for a lot of wicked people, when you think that a wake-up call would get them up and arise them, it doesn't. And that's unfortunately sometimes that's us too. God gives us a wake-up call and we don't take it. So we have to be careful about that sort of thing. But it is interesting, even with all the dread that had fallen on the people, that there still is a large grouping of people who want to hurt the Jews, and who take plans to hurt the Jews, even with that second decree. Um, but again, of course, God's on their side, but he's not mentioned here. So there are a few other things that are mentioned. One, the Jews are assembling in their city. So you do see a unity that takes place among the people, a sense of community. It's like a house divided against itself cannot stand sort of thing. So house united, of course, can stand would be the corollary to that. So you get that, but then I think Chris had mentioned this. Verse 3 mentions all the princes, the provinces, or the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, those doing the king's business. So they do have allies, and that's an integral part of this, especially when you're not mentioning God. It does sort of beg the question. And of course, God really is the one who's bringing all this to fruition. So he's got his hands on all of this. But it is interesting that you do have such a such a strong turning of the tide. Um, it's kind of like, well, and of course, at this point, you've got a lot of rulers that, um, they're probably looking to see what's going to happen, what's most advantageous to them, because that's what rulers do. And they ally themselves with what's most advantageous. Um, but even like with Haman. I remember Harbona, one of the eunuchs, he's like, "Oh, by the way, Haman built some gallows. Why don't we hang him on it?" In chapter 7. So like you do have these rulers who are probably opportunistic, more than anything, but at the same time, it does benefit the Jews. And so, you do have some rulers and some workers and things that do assist the Jews. So you gotta acknowledge that. Um, and I mean, this is a lot of destruction. Even yeah, right there in Shushan, got 500 people killed. And among them, the 10 sons of Haman. Um, and then, of course, you're going to have an explanation about what's going to happen with all that. But it does say that they did not lay their hands on the plunder in verse 10, which I find to be interesting. That sounds again like invasion and conquest sort of language. Like they're not doing this for stuff, they're not doing this for power. It is merely in the sense of defending themselves. Um, so if they had done that, there may have been accusations that they violated their authority given in the second decree, and then that would have led to more bloodshed. But what they end up doing is they refrain from putting their hands on the plunder, and all that's going to end up going to Esther and Mordecai's household, anyways. But um, it's just they go about it in a really systematic and thoughtful way. But again, lots of death and lots of needless death. Haman's dead. He was the Hitler of these people. I mean, as far as trying to exterminate the Jews, he was the leader. But there still is a cohort of people who need to be dealt with, and they get dealt with. And they're dealt with judicially and because of the decree, and they have the chance not to continue on their path. So, some people might look at this and be like, well, this is murderous. This is a tirade. This is kind of tyrannical. Um, and bloody and violent, and that's just not something uh, that's not flattering for the Jews or whatever. But the Jews are acting as um, punitive agents of the state. So it is interesting to consider that dynamic of it, um, and the self-defense angle of it all. So it's just kind of an I guess an earlier sort of example of state-approved self-defense. So from a legal standpoint, I think that's an interesting point to be made. Andrew?
Well, it is kind of a little bit ironic um, in how everybody now is uh, coming together to back up Mordecai and the Jews. But it just goes to show that you get a real sense of Mordecai's character. Now, I'm not saying that everybody um, had the best motive of well, I'm of support Mordecai because he is, from what we can probably tell, a very godly man. I mean, he is in a position of great influence, and so why wouldn't you, if you have the ear of the king, or if you're near the king, you would use that to your advantage in whatever way possible. If a Jew now is at the like right hand of the king, then it would bode well for these other leaders to do what they could to support for their own personal benefit. I mean, we just don't ultimately know, but I don't think that that's too far of a stretch to say that they weren't just doing it out of purely the motive of caring for the Jews. Um, as we've seen kind of throughout the text, everyone has been outside of like Mordecai and course, Esther, very few individuals, and, and some of the eunuchs, um, have been more or less out for themselves. And but here we, I think, get a kind of more of a seeing of Mordecai's uh, character, um, or reputation, the importance of having a good name, good reputation. Um, and even though God's not mentioned, you just see that God blessing Mordecai and, of course, the Jews with the ability to justly protect themselves from extermination. And that a good example of God's complete and perfect justice. And I don't know if people grasp this, but the number 10 is, to someone that was a Jew, was a perfect number. And Haman having at least 10 sons, and um, the 10 sons that were killed, you get a sense of, okay, that line, that household was dealt with complete justice, um, so that there would be nothing that would stir up again to go out to harm the Jews. And so um, God does, uh, or allows things to happen. Um, and I know that people could see this as well, as in multiple places in the text of the scripture. It does not look at this as um, a demonstration of perfect justice being demonstrated, righteous justice being demonstrated. That this wasn't vengeful um, uh, killing or whatever. And um, as we've alluded to throughout our discussions, it's just hard to not see God at work, and protecting um, the people that would ultimately bring forth the Messiah. That He is working behind the scenes, ultimately going to be victorious in bringing forth the Savior. And that's just a thing we need to keep in mind. But we still got more to look at, even though that this is hinting at some of the deaths, even in the capital proper. That would have been the capital proper that we looked at in the in Persia at the time. So if you would, Eric, now read from 11 to 15.
On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the capital in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall even be granted you. And what is your further request? It shall also be done." Then said Esther, "If it pleases the king, let tomorrow also be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the edict of today, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded that it should be done so, and an edict was issued in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. So obviously there's going to be a report made to the king about what happened on that day. And so you've got reporting of, again, the 500 that had been killed. And I wish we had kind of the nonverbal communication. I wish we could see how Ahasuerus said what he says to Esther. He's kind of like, if this happened in Susa, imagine what else has happened throughout the empire. I feel like that could be taken a couple different ways. Um, One could be like fear on his part. And of course that fear could go a couple different ways. One would be how many people have died in my empire. Although, most emperors of superpowers could probably care less, but as long as they have their power. Um, but there could be a fear side of things, like what happened, this has gotten way out of hand. On the other side, it could have been fear in the sense of what almost happened um, to the Jews, just wanton destruction of the Jews. I didn't realize this was so big. And, maybe I have to reevaluate my cabinet people. And, there could be a lot of fear there. Um, but then on the other side, it could just be almost like a statement of fact. You know, the Jews have been very successful here in Susa. I'm sure they've been successful throughout the empire. Esther, what do you want to do now? Do you feel like there's anything that's been left undone? It could be sort of that way of looking at things, or maybe just a combination of things. Emotions don't tend to come in singular entities. They tend to come kind of all mishmashed together. So there could be a lot of things going through the king's mind. But Esther, props to her again. She says, "Give us another day, and we'll take care of business. We'll take care of anything that's left over." And you know, she's got spirit and she's got fire. I'll give her that. She makes a bold request, and the king says, "You got it," which has been the story throughout the book. Esther has not been willy-nilly in making these requests, but this one does just kind of rattle right off the tongue, a little different than the others, but she gets pretty much everything she asked for because she's found favor in the sight of the king, which is again one of those kind of signature elements of um, providence, where you've got somebody who is a good character finding favor with everybody around them because God has unlocked that for them. Um, Obviously, again, this is poetic justice. They take the 10 sons, they hang them from the gallows of Haman as well. Um, and that's on the 14th day. 300 more men in the capital are killed. And I wonder about that. Did they just escape on the 13th day? Or was it that there was like a second movement? Maybe it was family members of those killed in the first kind of sweeping through the city. Maybe there was family members that wanted some more justice. So, I wonder what that 300 people, that 300 group, that cadre of people, would be, and what sort of influenced them to try and make a move on the second day, given how many people had been killed. So I do wonder about that. I wish we knew more about that. But again, you get the statement, the ending statement, but they did not lay hands on the plunder. So again, it's not about money, it's not about stuff, it's not about power, it's about self-defense, the whole thing. And again, the clarity of this is going to prevent future revolts and future rebellions on that pretext. Now, Persia dealt with a lot of rebellions for other reasons. And you can see that like on the Behistun inscription in Iran. But they have all kinds of issues that they deal with, but this is not going to be a pretext for a never-ending war between two cultural elements in Persia. It's going to be stomped out. This is why this happened. There was um, a move to destroy this entire culture of people, and they were given the power to defend themselves. It's a very just process as far as things go. Chris?
Think it's like you said, kind of the poetic justice of Haman building the gallows earlier on Mordecai's going to be hung on those gallows, and then we see Haman is ultimately the one hung. And then Esther makes the request of making an example again of his sons and hanging them from the gallows too. Um, it's I can only imagine the visual of that, what message that would send to maybe those who kind of had sympathized with Haman's point of view. Um, but you guys know I love reading the Old Testament. I love going through these stories. I love learning about the different groups of people. That's really why I've enjoyed Eric's class in Ezekiel, and then Andrew, you going through and looking at some maybe underappreciated characters in the Old Testament. Patterns and groups of people and all of that. It's so interesting how many different places you can look and be like, okay, I can make this connection with this and this one with this. You all had mentioned this when we were going through chapter 3 about Haman being an Amalekite and his descendants being from there. The interesting thing about that is in 1 Samuel 15, we see a descendant of Benjamin, the first king of Israel, Saul, told to destroy the Amalekites, and he doesn't do it. Over in Esther 2, we're introduced to Mordecai, who is also from the tribe of Benjamin, who ultimately will make an example of Amalekite descendants. The the connection of that, it may be absolutely nothing, but I think it's so interesting being able to look back at that story of Saul, who was put into a position of power, really the first person um, to assume the role of king of Israel that they desired. Obviously, God was the king first, but he didn't do what he was told to do. And he was punished because he didn't do what he was told to do. And the Amalekites then become a problem consistently for the children of Israel because of his inability to do what God had told him to do. Then we fast forward to Mordecai. It's almost like God just hands Haman to Mordecai almost. And Mordecai does what he's supposed to do. Haman was taken care of. When Esther makes this request, take care of Haman's sons. Make him an example. And for me, I'm sure you guys do this too. When you read, it's like, well, I wonder how different the narrative would be if you just would have done this. You think about if Saul would have just destroyed the Amalekites the way he was supposed to, there is no Haman.
Yeah.
There is none of the story that happens. Um, so you think your decisions and choices don't have lasting impact. Tell Mordecai as his life is being threatened and the Jews that doesn't happen, because you think, well, that was so long ago with Saul. It still is connected with that somewhat. Um, and that kind of opens my eyes. Our choices have impact sometimes generations beyond us. You decide to become a child of God. That has impact directly on your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, but on their children and great grandchildren and all that. It's all connected. So I just think it's so ironic that someone from the tribe of Benjamin is having an interaction with the Amalekites, and this time Haman is taken out. He's hung. He's made an example. His sons are too. But like Eric had said, one thing that we see from Saul, Saul spared the people and he took the possessions too. But for the Jews this time, he's not worried about that. Mordecai's not worried about that. Esther's not worried about that. It's about doing what they need to do to defend themselves. And God had given them the ability to do that. They're not overstepping that. They're not doing what they're not supposed to do, like we seen Saul do at times. Step outside of what God had commanded him to do. We see that throughout a lot of kings, and what Eric's going through in Ezekiel, you see that time and time again talked about how they're consistently disobedient. Um, and you think about the principal verse that Andrew read, kind of Mordecai's pep talk with Esther. At this point in time, Ahasuerus is listening to what Esther says, like Eric said. any request she makes, he's pretty much like, yes, that's okay. If she doesn't step up to the plate, who's in his ear at this point? We wouldn't know. So there's so many different parts of this story that to me it's just like you think, well, that's just a small decision you make. It's all interconnected. And I love the way the scriptures flow and how we can look at different stories and accounts of things. And it's like, that's an interesting little nugget we can add to that. Um, but this was a long time coming for God's judgment to come against the Amalekites. It was a long time coming. Um, and we're lucky that we can read it and see it take place. God's will is going to be accomplished. We may think we can get in the way and stop it, but ultimately God's will is going to be accomplished as we see throughout this story. We got Andrew.
Before I read the last section, I'll be very brief and just the verses we just read. What we've seen with Queen Esther, she's had to come to the king in humble submission. I'm not saying that that didn't occur to this time, but there's no indication that it was given in this instance. They're together, and the king's, talking to um, Queen Esther, and he's the one presenting now, kind of like, okay, what further, Esther, do you require? And so Esther's still being humble, but it's as if there is more of I don't know if a connection between them versus or more of a lack of distance between them. And just one final thing. Um, there is self-control shown by the Jews because it's over and over stated that they didn't take the plunder, and how easy and quick we are as people just to want to seek our own personal gain. And here's an instance of self-restraint, and that's just a good lesson when it could have easily been taken. All
That make
right.
me think of Aiken.
Huh? Oh,
Made
yeah.
me think of Aiken.
All right. And the last few verses in this section, beginning in verse 16. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, made a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made a feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So, only from what we could tell, that Susa, the main area, that an extra day was given in edict to go out and provide self-defense, um, which kind of makes sense. I mean, that's what the king could see. And in reality, you can't get a notice throughout the whole kingdom in just that short amount of time. It would not happen. But at least in the main area that they could deal with if there was any further uprising. So we see here that 75,000 throughout the 127 satraps. So this is no small skirmish. Now we don't know from like which province was the greatest of battles that occurred, but still 75,000 people lost their lives because they tried to uh, kill the Jews. Yet again, and I think this is the third time that they did not lay hands on the plunder. very important number, three, for where you're seeing God's hand in this. 3, 10, those are numbers that are connected to God. So if you don't see God said specifically, you can sometimes in numbers, like 3, 7, 10, certain numbers got a God connection to someone who was of the Jewish faith. And we see it throughout scripture. God tied to certain numbers. Think about God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the Godhead. But the following day, the 14th day, the people in the surrounding areas rested, feasted, and rejoiced over the victory. Um, of course, in verses 18 and 19, on the 14th day, they had to protect themselves. So the following day, on the 15th day, they did like the people in the surrounding areas, the rest of the empire, they made it a day of rest, rejoicing and feasting over the victory. So, um, yeah, just and we're not even finished yet with the text, but it's almost as if you could end it right there, and you could say that everything is all well. Things ended up peaceful. There's more to come, but so far it looks like things are starting to end up finally hopeful and going to work out for the Jews. Any final thoughts on this last section, Eric?
That's almost 600 people per satrapy, on average. Now, some of those would have been more than others, like you said, Andrew, but that's a lot of people. And it also reveals to us that Haman was not an isolated figure as far as his anti-Semitism. You don't get tens of thousands of people moved very quickly. It takes time and it takes the stoking of prejudices. And Haman was a master of that, but there was an underlying anti-Semitism there for sure. And there could have been a lot of reasons for that. Um, there could have been a lot of reasons for that, but that again informs us a little bit on the fact that Mordecai early on said, "Don't tell anybody that you're a Jew, Esther." Um, which we kind of talked about why he would want to withhold that information. There's an assumed prejudice, but now the extent of that prejudice is more revealed to us that it was tens of thousands of people. I mean, you're closing in on 100,000 people that probably had major issues with them. Um, I so that's kind of what I would point out. In addition to that, of course, we're laying the groundwork for Purim, which is going to be the rest of the chapter and chapter 10. Chris, you have anything to add?
One thing I wanted to point out is that they still celebrate Purim. So it's something that was a major significance. You think of like the Passover, that's a major significant event of God passing over them in a foreign land and ultimately delivering them from the people. Purim, similar in the same way, not necessarily passing over, but putting people in positions, guiding things by his hand to ultimately protect them. Um, and you would think throughout their history, which I know you've talked about this a lot in your Ezekiel class, I keep coming back to that, but you would think they would have learned at some point. You after what happened in Egypt, you'd be like, I'm going to tell everybody I can about this deliverance. Same thing with this as well. Many heed it. I'm sure there were some that didn't necessarily heed it, but I think this is one of the more interesting days of remembrance because it doesn't really say that God told them to remember it necessarily, but you think of the buildup of we're going to be wiped off the face of the earth, and now they're feasting and happy because they've been delivered. what a major shift in tone and narrative right here of this day you've been counting down, everything's going to end potentially. Now you're sitting around feasting overjoyed because God's protected you and you've been able to be delivered from those who hate you. And like Eric had said, I think you see that a lot throughout the Old Testament, as well as if you look at historical uh, evidences. The Jews, specifically in the Old Testament, were hated by many people. Um, and a lot of that comes back to God's command to them when they entered the promised land to get rid of all those nations. They didn't do it, and ultimately those nations a lot of the times become a thorn in their side. They're constantly with Edom's the one that more so sticks out to me, constantly celebrating any type of um, hindrances or pain that was caused to the nation of Israel. I think ultimately they were hated because they were God's chosen people. I think many people in the land knew that. I think many of the Persians may have known that as well. We've heard what their God can do. Let's wipe them off the face of the earth. After what happened to Haman, you think they would have stood down. After what happened to his son, you think they would have stood down, but they didn't. So, you know, it wasn't because they were the Jews that made them special. It wasn't just because they were descendants of Abraham that made them special. It was because of the covenant that their forefathers and them had made with God that made them special. So good luck, Haman. Haman, it didn't work out for him, didn't work out for his sons. It's not going to work out for anybody that trusts to stand against God. And that was that Feast of Purim that I know we're going to talk about next week. It's a good reminder, not only for them, but us of, God's deliverance and um, forethought to protect us maybe from things that we are aware of and things that maybe we're not.
Our own hate destroys ourselves, and that's just something to take away from these last verses. And really, we saw it in Haman's character. And we just need to be careful that uh, I've heard resentment is the number one offender. If we have that hatred uh, toward ourselves and others, I mean, ultimately that's going to be directed toward God. Um, if people, even if they don't believe in God, that's going to be directed toward Him. I mean, it's going to destroy ourselves. So we have to be careful. Um, and people who hate it lost their lives here. And we can learn much from that. It's so important that we need to cultivate love in our life, love of God and love of our fellow neighbor, and even love for our enemy. And that's what was not seen among these people that lost their lives. But they made their choices, and we must make our choices. So hopefully, we can learn from this book. God's name may not be written on it physically, but we can take so many lessons, not only God's providence, but so many life lessons throughout what we've seen so far. And Lord willing, we'll wrap it up hopefully next week and not in 2 months or whatever. But we just never know. Things happen, as we said at the beginning of our video discussion, and sometimes good things happen. Sometimes life just comes about, and things have to be put off. But we just thank you that we were able to come back, and if the Lord permits, we'll be back. It's always Lord willing. And we hope that, Lord willing, you benefited from our discussion, that you didn't take us as the authority, that you're looking to the authority being God, His word. And we hope that we just gave glory to God, that we're pointing to Him and want to point Him to you. And if you're watching and you're kind of uh, not sure about your relationship with God or have questions about what we've talked about, we just invite you to reach out to us. We would love to have further conversations uh, with you, whether it be in reference to what we talked about here today or having a relationship with God. What's that look like? What's the gospel all about? And don't hesitate to find us on either Facebook at Taylorsville Road Church of Christ or at TaylorsvilleRDChurchofChrist.com. That's the website. You can reach us out there, and we would love to get back with you. And so we thank you for taking time out of your day, and we hope that you will plan on tuning in when we have our next episode of Three Guys in the Word. But until then, may God bless you and take care.